The cue for this week, the French and Indian War, and it also has another name, and that was in the learning target. They called it the 7 Years' War as well. Yes, ma'am.
It's saying that we need access to the slideshow.
Uh-oh. Let me fix that real quick, because I know y'all like to follow along.
And also for the chapter 5 and 6 reading, it's also
Really?
saying, yeah.
Oh, goodness. Okay, yeah, let me do that
You
real
did
quick.
reading.
So sorry.
I needed it for the flashcards.
Oh, that's so smart. I was just gonna Google it.
Okay,
I'm just
so
Googling that.
share.
I'm reading for the flashcards, but it was like small.
I'm just Googling.
Oh, it was only 5 and 6. Well, I think it was. Yeah, this is what
Thank you.
for 5 and 6.
Okay.
I just almost fell.
It's beginning of sorry?
Yes.
We called it the French and Indian War because we, Americans, as British citizens, so we were British, we were fighting against the French and the Indians. They were tag teamed. Yes, we are. Rocking and
Do you have any
rolling.
more fun
Takes a
colors?
little while to get through some of them, some go real quick.
Do you have green?
So, this is the stage. This is what it looks like in 1754, whenever the war starts. You have the British colonies here. The yellow, this is established, well-maintained British colonies with the Americans living here. The French are the pink. The green are the Spanish. You can see you got some French here in what's now Haiti. But you also have some British down in the Caribbean as well, like what is now Jamaica. And the French are just kind of sandwiched between the British here in North America. Where this war will erupt, of course, is in this disputed part that both the French and the British claim, particularly here along the Ohio River Valley. So what we are looking at actually is mostly the West Virginia part of the Ohio River Valley. So this war starts with George Washington. George Washington starts this war. George Washington is a colonel in the Virginia militia under the Virginia Royal Governor. The Virginia Royal Governor has sent out George Washington and a militia to go see what the French are up to along the Ohio River Valley. And this is George Washington wearing a British colonial American uniform, okay? So he is working, obviously, for the British, because we are British citizens at this time. But George Washington, he starts this whole war. And this whole war turns into, quite honestly, the first worldwide war, because pretty much most of the countries in Europe get involved too. It's not just the British and the French here in North America. It becomes the 7 Years' War in Europe, which is a really big deal to those folks in Europe. So, Washington runs into a small group of French soldiers. And when I say a small group, they were like the scouts, because they were checking out to see what the British were up to. So whenever Washington runs into them, he starts shooting, and he kills those scouts, and then he's like, uh-oh, I might have started something. So he builds what becomes Fort Necessity, which is him and his little militia. They fortify themselves in a hastily built fort, which is basically a bunch of logs that they split and are standing up out of the ground. Look like a trench in front of it. And he put this fort necessity in the middle of a clearing in a meadow. So he's very exposed out in the open. Not a good idea. And he sends a rider back to the royal governor of Virginia. They're in Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia has moved to Williamsburg, out of Jamestown, and says, I think I'm gonna swerve at something. You might want to send some reinforcements. Because he knows the French are going to attack him. He killed French soldiers, so he knows that the French will come after him, and they do. And they force Washington to surrender Fort Necessity because they just routed him. I mean, it's ugly. And that's the start of the war. George Washington. Thanks, George. So yeah, this is what kind of kicks it off. George Washington is sent just on a scouting mission, and it kicks off a war that will last 9 years in North America, and a worldwide conflict, but mostly in Europe, that will last 7 years. So Washington does become a commander within the British system during this war, because he and his Virginia militia will be sent out again to battle, and the commanding British officer, as it's shown in this painting, will be shot and killed on the battlefield, and he does leave command to George Washington. So this is when George Washington gets a command of even British troops. And he actually does pretty well with it. You wouldn't have thought it with the whole building of Fort Necessity, where he built Fort Necessity, but I think he learned from his mistakes. We're not going to talk about a lot of it, well, any really, of the individual battles and things like that. But you can see where you see the little blocks and things like that. Those are forts where you see a starburst or just a star. Those were battles, and whichever side won. If it is red, it's a British victory. If it's black like this, that is a French victory. And so you can see a lot of this is the Ohio River Valley, up around the Great Lakes, into what's now Canada, all of that disputed territory. So the French and Indian War, also known as 7 Years' War, does last 9 years. It lasts 9 years in North America. The Europeans call it the 7 Years' War because it lasted 7 years in Europe. Okay, we call it the French and Indian War because we Americans were fighting against the French and the Indians. If you like movies based on a historical event, this is an oldie but goodie, Last of the Mohicans. This is actually based on an early piece of great American literature. And it is about how this guy, who is an American that was raised with Indians, helped fight in the war. It's really good. So the conflict is isolated to North America for the first 2 years, but then Great Britain and France start fighting each other in Europe, and then they get allies in Europe, and then they start fighting each other as well. And their colonies around the world will fight each other, so it does become a worldwide conflict. When I say oldie but goodie, I think this was made like even in the 1980s. It's real old, but it's still really good. All right, so we looked at this earlier, and this is the Ben Franklin political cartoon where he is trying to encourage the colonies to join together in what he called the Albany Plan of Union. And there was an Albany Congress. Albany as in Albany, New York. Albany, New York, which is the capital of New York State right now, and a good-sized city back in 1754. So the Albany Congress, this is the first time we're going to call the colonies together into one meeting. And it is to strategize and to unify as one force in this war against the French and the Indians. So the folks that showed up to the Albany Congress, and we're talking obviously Pitt Franklin, we're talking the Adams brothers, and then you also got John Adams from Massachusetts and Samuel Adams out in Boston. They were cousins. And you know, most of those founding father type guys, they're going to attend. They think this is a good idea, but when they go back home to Massachusetts or back to Virginia or wherever they're from, they cannot get their home legislatures to agree to this. And when I say the home legislatures, they're elected assemblies. Like in Virginia, you had the House of Burgesses that was elected by the people. And they said, no, we're just gonna let England deal with this, Britain deal with this, and they'll tell us what to do. We don't need to come up with our own plan or strategy. Ben Franklin, of course, created this cartoon, and it also starts to let us know that at this point, way back in the 1750s, at least some Americans were thinking of the colonies as a single nation. Not different states, not different colonies, but one nation, an American nation. So this is the beginning of us thinking of ourselves as different, as Americans, and not just British that happen to live over here in America. And that's kind of a really big deal. Once you start seeing yourself as different from the established government. You don't need to list this, but this is going to be a cause of maybe another divide between us Americans and the British. And George Washington talks about this a lot. Whenever it comes to how the fighting occurs during the French and Indian War, the colonials prefer to fight like this. The colonial militias wanted to fight much like the Indians had fought against America for the past 200 years. And that was sneak attacks, guerrilla attacks, just, you know, not announce that you're coming and lining up in an open field. That's how the British wanted to do it. They wanted to line in columns and formations, fire the weapons on signal, and then commence a bayonet attack. The colonials did not think that was a good idea. As far as military discipline, the colonials, the Americans, they respected rank, and but they were not so tied up in observing some rules and saluting and things like that. The British, it was all about drilling and very tough discipline. To pay for this war, because a war is usually the most expensive thing a government can engage in, the colonists, they didn't want to have to pay for it with higher taxes. The British thought they should. This is being fought in America. We should be winning more American land from the French, so you Americans should have to pay with higher taxes. So Americans, the colonists, should have to pay for their own defense. And finally, the kind of the demeanor, particularly of the officers. In the American side of things, they could not be commissioned officers within the British military. They could be leaders of American militia. They could lead British troops, but they still could not be commissioned officers. So they were non-professionals. However, the British, they were super professionals and almost prima donnas, like very elitist, if you made the rank of a colonel or above. And they traveled with fine china and tea services and tables and chairs and things like that, so they can, have their afternoon tea and things like that. So there's a difference between the colonials and the British, even within this military where we're supposed to be one unit. All right, to kind of wrap this up with the war, the political leader in Great Britain at the time is this dude, William Pitt, as in Pittsburgh, right? Whenever we win the French and Indian War and we gain the land from the French that is now where Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is, it's going to be named after this guy. So he's the English Prime Minister, and he is going to say, all right, you colonials, y'all are dumb and primitive and you don't know what you're doing. Just follow our lead. If we need your help, Americans, we'll let you know. So George Washington was back to leading American militia again. So everything was controlled by the British. And a lot of times when they needed help and there weren't enough American volunteers for the militia, colonists were impressed, which is another way of saying drafted, but nowadays if you're drafted into the military, sometimes it's bad luck. Your number got drawn in front of somebody else's number. But in this way, that the British military would literally go from town to town and look for young men and basically kidnap them and force them to join the military. That's what being impressed is. Kidnapped and forced to join. And colonists were impressed, particularly along the frontier. They weren't doing this in Boston or New York City. They were doing it in places like Pittsburgh and Cleveland and places like that on the frontier where the war was being fought. The British also went to businesses and confiscated what they thought they needed for supplies, whether it was ammunition, whether it was gunpowder, whether it was wheels for their wagons, food from farmers, and in the moment, the British commander in charge would say, you will get paid for this, but we need this right now, so we're taking this right now, and I'll just leave you with this promissory note saying you'll eventually get paid. And a lot of Americans obviously never did see that money, and obviously that's going to create some hard feelings. And don't forget this, quartering. British started to live in the Americans' homes, taking over their homes. It's not like if you lived out on the frontier and the British Army was coming in, they would just, ask nicely to sleep on your floor that night. No, they would kick you out of your house and take it over. And they would tell you, well, come back in about 6 months or so. And while you're gone, they're just, they're living in your home, they're eating your food, they're doing whatever, and you're just hoping for the best. We know that we are victorious in the French and Indian War, and there are some things that are going to change. To end the dispute of the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War, we get the Treaty of Paris, 1763. There's going to be several treaties of Paris. Okay? So this date is actually important. In fact, the dates of the French and Indian War, there's only a handful of dates you have to remember in this course. The dates of the French and Indian War is one of them. Okay? Because it's really a turning point in leading up to the American independence movement. So the Treaty of Paris, 1763. So, all of Canada and the land east of the Mississippi River, so from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean, all of that now belongs to Great Britain, to England. So the French are pretty much kicked out of the North American continent. They lose all the territory in the North American continent. Land west of the Mississippi will go to Spain. French claim some of that too, but now Spain gets it because Spain was one of the allies of Great Britain, so they're on the winning side of the war that was happening elsewhere in Europe. So those are the two big changes with the Treaty of Paris, 1763. So this is what the map looks like now. It did look like this, with the French being all up in here, but now it looks like this. No French territory in North America at all. The only place France still is right here in what's now Haiti. They aren't going to be there long either. There's going to be a slave revolt there that'll kick them out. But notice this red line. And this red line becomes pretty important. We'll get to it tomorrow. But there is a line that the British colonies, that's the termination point of the British colonies. So the Americans living here are told, you gotta stay over here on that side of the line. Can't go past it. Can't go past it. Alright, so the outcomes. Let's start with the Indians, because the French and Indian War, we talked about what happened with the French. They got kicked out of the North American continent. The Indians, they also lose, right? Pontiac's uprising, they are going to keep on fighting. Their French allies have surrendered, but the Indians were like, hey, we still got some fight left. We are not giving up. Pontiac is the name of the Indian leader, and they're going to do all right for a while. They're going to capture some of the British forts along the Ohio River Valley. However, just like a lot of the contact between the Europeans and the Indians, eventually the Indians will just die off from the diseases that is just ravaging their population because of this more expanded contact with the Europeans and their nasty germs. And in particular with Pontiac's rebellion, there was a legend that the forts, when the British abandoned the forts, they left behind blankets contaminated with smallpox pus to intentionally infect the Indians. And that might not have happened exactly at Pontiac's uprising, but things like that did happen. We knew that the Indians were dying in droves because of disease, and from time to time, Americans, particularly military, would try to help that along. And this is the red line. Evidently, we're going to get to it right now. We'll talk about it more tomorrow too. So the British response to try to limit future conflicts with the natives. Don't gotta worry about the French no more. But there's still a lot of Native Americans out there that are still plenty mad about Europeans, particularly British Americans, taking over their land. So that's why the British drew that red line. The line was called the Proclamation Line of 1763, and it banned all settlement west of the peak of the Appalachians. So that's where they drew the line, at the peak of the Appalachian Mountains. You can settle on the uphill side, but you can't settle on the downhill side. The peak is the Proclamation Line. And this is supposed to, a concession to the Indians. We won't mess with you no more. So don't mess with our people on the frontier. But also, it's to prevent future wars that will cost a lot of money. It was really more of, it was more of that than a nice gesture to the Indians. We just don't want to have to go to war because we don't want to have the expense. So the Americans, you can't move. This should have changed the timing on this one. This one should have came up with the past one. But yeah, you can see where all of these are going to defining within Pontiac's uprising. Alright. So this is the last slide, I think, of the notes. So the aftermath of the war, there are several long-term outcomes here. First, for the British. It greatly expanded Britain's empire. So they have more territory, they have more land, not just in North America. They won more territory around the world. They took other places from the French around the world. But they're in a lot of debt. The war was very, very expensive, and now they're in debt, and that was important back then. The United States, we have a tremendous debt nowadays, right? And we really don't talk about it too much. But back then, they thought that debt was weakness. So they wanted to try to crawl out of this debt. And of course, we're going to talk about how they charge taxes on the Americans. And then you know what that leads to. So the British, they get more land, but more responsibility, and they have a larger debt for the colonists. Even though the Albany Plan of Union didn't work, we still did come together to fight against a common foe, the French and the Indians. And it did get us talking about an American identity. The American militia was doing a lot of the work on the frontier. And as a result of this war, we do see ourselves as American. People would say that they're American before they would say they were British a lot of times, which is a big changeover. The British troops don't leave. The British troops that were over here during the war, they're going to stick around. And in fact, the British are going to start sending more whenever the colonists start acting up. And they're going to be living in people's homes. We have to quarter the troops. But also, the British are making the colonial legislatures pay for those soldiers. So that means that the colonies are going to have to raise taxes on the Americans to take care of the British soldiers. And then lastly, for the American Indians, it's all bad news all the time for the American Indians. There's going to be one little bright spot later on, but then it's quickly dashed. But the American Indians, those who had allied with France, now were out on their own. And a lot of them will just kind of crumble and fall away. There were some Native American tribes that were allied with the English. And they won a few concessions, but eventually the American government went back on that and took it anyway. Alright. So that's all with the notes there. We're going to take a look at a John Green crash course video over the 7 Years' War.